Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all this evening. Happy, what are we, Thursday? A bit of admin. Can you all hear me? Nods, fabulous. If anybody needs it, you can turn on closed captions or subtitles by pressing the 3 dots at the bottom and then clicking captions, and that should pop up for you and then you can read it. But if anybody has any tech issues, just shout at us or write in the chat whilst we're talking, and either Emma or any of the others behind the scenes can help you out if you're having any problems. So I'm going to talk for kind of 20-25 minutes, a little bit. We've got some videos, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. If you've got any questions whilst we're talking, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll come to them at the end. And then when we come to the Q&A, you can all either type in the chat or shout out as your questions or whatever works for you, really. So I am going to share my screen, assuming this works. I now make it a bit bigger. Oh, no, I've lost all of you. Right. Can you see the presentation? I can't see you anymore, so someone has to make a noise. Yep, fabulous. Okay, great. So I can't really see anybody anymore. So if you have any pickle or you need to grab my attention, please shout at me. So hello, I hope you're having a nice day. I am going to talk about the red-billed chough and our reintroduction project to reintroduce the bird to the White Cliffs of Dover. And so, first of all, thought it'd be helpful if we talk about what on earth is a chough, because they have been missing from Kent for over 200 years. So it makes sense if we're all a bit like, what on earth is this bird these people are going on about? So they're a member of the corvid family, which includes other things like crows and rooks and jackdaws. But these guys are kind of cool because they have this black body, but they've also got this red beak and little red feet. And they're actually the rarest member of the corvid family in Britain. And they're, I always get this wrong, both in pronunciation and in meaning, but their Latin name is Pyrrhocorax pyrrhocorax, which means flame raven, which is pretty cool because they're this black bird with this red flame coloured beak. And like we said before, they've been missing from Kent for over 200 years, but didn't talk about why in a bit more detail. So, as we said, we've got this black body and these really sort of jet black dark feathers, but this really bright feet. And then they've got this quite sort of broad, deeply fingered wingspan, which means they can do this sort of really amazing flying. And I'm going to play a little sound of the noises they make. And they can make some really funky noises. This is by no means the only noise they can make. So let me know if this sound works. Oh, it's gone. Come back. Can you hear that?
Yes, you can.
They make a kind of somewhat familiar sound, but it's a bit different than your average kind of crow. So that is our chough that we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about this project that I mentioned that's trying to bring these birds back to the White Cliffs of Dover. So it's a partnership project. Emma mentioned that you've got myself, I work for Kent Wildlife Trust here today, but we also have our colleagues at Wildwood, and it's a partnership project between both organisations. And for those of you who might not know, Kent Wildlife Trust is one of 46 wildlife trusts throughout the UK. We work in land management, we look after reserves, we have visitor centres, and Wildwood, maybe some of you are familiar with, runs a native British wildlife park just outside Canterbury, and they have choughs there. So it's a really nice partnership between both organisations. But not only is it us two, we're also working in partnership with a few other organisations, including Paradise Park, their wildlife sanctuary in Cornwall, and they breed chough there. And we've also been working with English Heritage, and on Dover Castle in Dover, there is an aviary with choughs in there at the moment. The two of them have just arrived for the spring. So I'm going to go to the next slide. There are 5 different elements of the project, really. One is release these birds. So we want a healthy population in Dover. We want to develop new and successful practices for how on earth you release these birds into the wild. But also we need to make sure that the habitat and the environment of Dover is suitable for these birds. So we might need to restore additional habitat to make sure it's good for the chough. We want to engage and work with people who live and work in and around Dover to ensure that this project works for them and works with them. And we also want to research how we do these things and how we do these things better so that we can improve and share that learning. So if other people repeat this kind of project, they make new mistakes. They don't make the same mistakes we've made, but we're continually learning and sort of evolving. They're the kind of key elements. So if we talk about them in a bit more detail, so this map shows the current distribution in the purple blobs of the chough throughout the UK and Ireland. And so you can see, if you look at the bottom right, there is none in Kent. And our kind of closest populations are in Cornwall and Wales. Very interestingly, the birds you find in Cornwall actually got there themselves in 2001. Previously, they were extinct in Cornwall, but it's thought that a few individuals flew from Ireland to Cornwall and re-established the population there. But that's quite sort of, I guess rare isn't quite the right word, but not expected, because choughs are actually quite sedentary. So they like staying in one place. They don't tend to fly big distances and they don't migrate. So the likelihood of them flying by themselves from Cornwall or from Wales all the way to Kent is pretty slim. And so the project is setting out to try and improve, not just by reintroducing birds to Kent, but improve the health of the population throughout the UK by restoring this population in Kent. So, it's worth also mentioning, because we have her on the call, but choughs were also reintroduced to the island of Jersey down here in the south. And Elizabeth Corrie, or Liz Corrie, who worked on that project for many years, is now working and supporting the chough reintroduction in Kent. So again, we have that growth and continuation of knowledge across these projects. So, as we mentioned before, chough have experienced pretty bad population decline and have been pretty much extinct throughout England, at least, before they flew back to Cornwall in the early 2000s. But previous to that, they did used to be far more widespread in the UK and Ireland. And it's thought that a variety of factors caused that population to decline, including agricultural intensification, changes in grazing. So we're going to talk a little bit about the habitat the choughs need, and that the change in our agricultural practices meant that they lost that habitat, and therefore we lost the choughs. But very interestingly, in 1532, there was the Preservation of Grain Act, and I'm going to forget who introduced it. Can I find it? Ah, yes, it was Henry VIII. There we go. And strengthened by Elizabeth I. It's useful when you write things down. So that act encouraged and made it compulsory for everybody to kill as many creatures as possible that they classified as vermin. And the list of vermin was somewhat arbitrary and included chough. And this was supposed to preserve grain, but is kind of nonsense, because chough eat insects and therefore don't really have any impact on grain. But this was one of the factors that caused the real decline in the population. So if I go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about why Dover, and again, how we're doing these different things to ensure that we get these birds back to Dover. So chough need certain things in their habitat. I'm actually going to go to the next slide and then come back to this one. So they predominantly need short grass. So chough are insectivores, which means that they eat insects, and they tend to eat soil insects, and they use their sort of long curved bill to probe the soil for different insects to then eat them. And if you can imagine, if the grass is really, really, really long, choughs are not very big, they would find it really difficult to probe into that soil to eat those insects. And so they often have a kind of interesting relationship with grazing animals. So you can see in this top right picture, you have chough on a field where there are also different sheep. And so those sheep keep the grass short, which means the chough can access the insects in the soil. And so if we go back to our previous slide, Dover has a lot of grassland and a lot of chalk grassland, which is not only important for chough, but a really important habitat in its own right. And for the past, I want to say 40 years, if not a bit longer than that, different conservation organisations have been working in Dover along with the council and people who live in Dover to restore that chalk grassland. So you can see in the bottom right hand corner, this is a picture of an area of ground that stopped being chalk grassland. It had a few trees, a kind of scrubby environment with short bushes and stuff like that. And then trying to restore the chalk grassland. And it's really funny, this sort of like, it almost looks like a Hessian sack on the soil. That's really useful for holding the grassland seeds in place. You can imagine if you have this kind of fairly steep soil bank and you put loads of seeds on it and it rained or it was windy or something like that, all those seeds would just wash off. But if they use this sort of Hessian kind of, it's like a rug really, over the soil, it helps those seeds to stay in place and increases the chances of getting that grassland back, which is a really important habitat. With you get so much diversity and loads of different plants in that chalk grassland. And so because this work has been occurring in Dover and the environment of Dover is so good with all of this chalk grassland, it means you have the right habitat there for chough. But not only that, chough like to nest in cliffs often, in sort of crags and holes in the cliff. And if we think again about Dover, we've got those white cliffs. So we've got all those little craggy spaces and holes for them to nest in. And lastly, well, actually, penultimately, sorry, because of the maritime history in Dover, you've got a lot of these kind of old military buildings and sort of like those the concrete structures you find on the cliff. I'm forgetting the name now. I'm sure lots of you are very familiar with them from sort of the world wars, and they were constructed then. And chough also really like to nest in those. So again, you have this additional sort of nesting resource. And the last thing that makes Dover a really interesting and important place to bring back choughs is the cultural links between chough and Kent and chough and Dover. I'm going to come back to that later on in the presentation, but they're the key reasons why Dover is a good place to bring these birds back. So we talked about why the habitat is really important, and we talked about the things they eat. So this picture shows how the chough probe into the soil. They stab into the soil to get those soil insects. They like beetles and earthworms and dung beetles and ants and you name it, things they will eat in the soil. So I'm going to show you a little video of some choughs been about. So you can kind of see in this video how they use their little beak as sort of tweezers or chopsticks to sort of probe and pick up the different insects. You can see them kind of hopping about in a group, and the little red feet is so cute. You might also notice that all of these birds actually have rings on their legs, and they're not just a kind of fashion statement, but are used for, I'm sure many of you know this, but are used for identification, so we can see which bird is which, like a little ID tag. So we talked about these kind of well, some of these key elements of how we bring the chough back to Dover, and we've talked about habitat management a little bit already. We're going to talk about these other components that help us bring these birds back. So captive breeding. So we need birds to release them, right? And so Paradise Park, as well as Wildwood, are breeding baby chough so that we can release them. And these husbandry and breeding techniques have been developed over quite a while from both Paradise Park and Wildwood to develop those techniques so we can be as successful as possible. But also we mentioned habitat management. So our chough need short grasses, healthy soils, and abundant insect populations. So how do we create this? We can use livestock management. In order to have those healthy soils and those abundant insects, we need to reduce our use of insecticides. So if you imagine, insecticides are things that kill insects that some land managers use. If we use too many of them, we're going to kill the insects that are in the soil. And that means we kill that food source for those chough. So we're working with land managers in and around Dover to try and reduce that insecticide use so we have as many insects as possible for those chough to eat. Also working with schools and colleges. So we've created an education pack, which looks like this, which will soon be publicly available. It's not quite. And that can be used by primary schools to talk about the chough and learn about the chough, but also doing other things and workshops and working with older kids as well to get as many people as possible excited about this bird. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that one of the really cool reasons why Dover is the best place to bring the chough back is because of the cultural links between Dover and the chough. And so I'm going to show you a little video in a minute, which talks about those cultural links a little bit more. But effectively, the chough is tied into the story of Thomas à Becket, Henry II and Henry VIII and Shakespeare, all of which just gonna thank you, whoever muted. All of these people's stories are also tied into Dover. So I am going to show a little video and then we'll chat.
Sometime during the middle of and they were good friends. Henry liked Thomas so much, he made him Archbishop of Canterbury. However, Henry thought that Thomas soon became too big for his boots, and just a few days after Christmas, they had a big argument. Henry shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his most faithful knights overheard him and sped hard and fast to the cathedral.
Are we going to kill him? Yeah, I'm going to kill him before you kill him. Yeah, let's go. Oh, this is a good idea.
At this time, Thomas was in the crypt praying, unaware of the advancing knights. The knights entered the cathedral and stealthily approached the crypt. They crept up behind Thomas and began their attack. There was a fatal blow to the head. After the knights left, Thomas Becket lay dying on the floor of the crypt, with blood oozing out of him. As the light of the day faded, a crow looked down on the spire of the cathedral and slowly descended to where Thomas lay bleeding. He gently dipped his beak and legs in the blood of the Archbishop and was suddenly magically transformed into a bird with scarlet bill and feet. The spirit of Thomas flew into the air, the first red-billed chough.
Hello. So obviously the video is slightly aimed at children, but hopefully you enjoyed it. And hopefully that kind of sets the scene a little bit of the cultural links between the Chough and Thomas à Becket in that case, but also Dover. So what I discovered actually a couple of years ago, and I didn't know previous to that, is that one of the reasons Dover Castle is so heavily fortified is because when when Thomas Becket died, and people started to take pilgrimage to Canterbury from all over Europe to go to this holy place, there was nowhere in Kent at the time that was deemed fit for a king, but Henry II had to keep going and meet all these dignitaries who were coming from France and all of these places, but there was nowhere in Kent that was sort of suitable. And so Dover Castle, which at the time was far less fortified, was then massively built up into sort of somewhat what we see it today. And so again, we sort of tie those stories all into play. And lastly, on the Shakespeare part, in King Lear, they're talking about Dover and describing the choughs that are flying across the cliffs. And so again, we have the chough really placed in Dover and in the White Cliffs of Dover specifically, which I think makes it a pretty cool place, to be honest. So, excuse me. Oh, no, we don't need to watch you again. Thank you. So these cultural links obviously make our job a little bit easy, but we're working really hard to work with people throughout Dover to kind of share awareness of this project and hope that the Chough becomes part of Dover. And these are just some of the organisations that we've been working with and partnering with to do wildlife friendly, environmentally friendly stuff in Dover, but also stuff that maybe links with the Chough a little bit. And some of our team who are on the call include Jade and Jenny, who work in Dover a lot, working with all of those organisations we've just mentioned. I'm sure some of you on the call have already met them. They're always out and about. Again, working with communities in Dover to chat about the Chough, but also chat about anything and about anything related to kind of doing stuff for nature. So lastly, I'm just going to wrap up. What's coming next? Well, this spring, so it happened a couple of weeks ago, two of the Chough who live half at Wildwood, half at Dover Castle, returned to Dover Castle. So you've got Pyro and Becket, and they spent the summer, they kind of have a summer house, if you will, in an aviary at Dover Castle, and you can go visit them. For those of you who maybe do, maybe don't know, but schools can visit Dover Castle for free, and you can get the school's education pack can be sent to you for free if you're going to go visit the castle. We also have Chough breeding at Wildwood and Paradise Park, and it will be their offspring this summer that are released. So hopefully, if everything goes right, if we have good weather, if we have healthy birds and no sort of, you never know when you're working with wild animals, unexpected things could happen. But if all goes swimmingly, we should have Chough released this summer in Dover. So before we do the Q&A, I'm just going to chat a little bit lastly about how you can get involved. So we have loads of volunteering, whether it's if you like working outside and doing things in nature, there's lots of volunteering. If you like working with people, if you anything really, you could get involved with volunteering. If you or your community group want to get involved, you can chat to us or chat to Jade and Jenny. If you look after any land, whether it's your small front garden or huge fields or multiple fields, you can very much get involved. Please share as much information as you have and come to events, and obviously you can always donate to the project. So I'm going to stop having just me chatting away, and we will have a little bit of a Q&A. So I'm hanging around, you've still got me. You've also got Laura Gardner, who I will let introduce herself in a second, but she's the Director of Conservation at Wildwood. You've got Liz, who I mentioned earlier, who's in charge of the Chough releases. And you have Jade, who's one of our community organising officers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I click the right button. and leave it over to you guys really to ask any questions. Or no questions.
Yes, I do have a
Jasmine.
question. Apart from being splendid birds, what's the benefit to the ecology of the area of introducing choughs onto the grassland at Dover?
It's a really interesting question, and one that we ponder and think about a lot. And I think one of the really important things is that the bird are another flag to wave about the importance of chalk grassland, to try and encourage more chalk grassland to be restored, to encourage a reduction in insecticide and pesticide use, so that we have a healthier environment overall, not just for the chough, but for other reasons as well. Did you have anything to add, Lauren?
Yeah, just obviously it's a really, really good question. And Alicia has a good point made about the chough being a fantastic flagship species where you get the habitat right for the chough, and that benefits a whole host of other biodiversity as well. But because the species are insectivorous, anything that promotes more abundance of insects not only helps the animals that feed upon those insects, but also has a huge significant impact, a positive impact on soil health. So the invertebrates that live in the soil affect the quality of the soil, and that affects everything in terms of growing our crops, biodiversity, bioabundance. So yeah, it's having the chough as a charismatic species that benefits a whole host of other species as well is the main aim.
I would just add to that as an example that's literally just happening. Because of the Chough project, Kent Wildlife Trust have just got some funding, which has allowed the employment of somebody to be the Dover area land manager, and he's going to be hopefully going around networking with the farmers in the area, sort of telling about the Chough project, but really understanding the needs of the farmers, because it's one thing to say we want to do X, Y, and Z in conservation, but it's the other to try and understand really what's going on and the pressures on the farming community. So it's quite interesting to see that without even the birds going out there yet, just the premise of them being out there has allowed us to have this funding.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here from JP Hughes. It says the creche stage for young choughs is quite important to how the birds learn to read the landscape, where to feed, etc. from their first autumn. How do you think this will work with captive bred birds?
I can tell you exactly how it works because this is what we did in Jersey. So the plan with the birds is that choughs will take 6 or 7 weeks to fully fledge and be not quite independent from their parents. It'll be another 2 weeks after that. What happens with choughs in corvids is that they also go through this bouldering phase, where if you imagine a nest in the wild on maybe like in a sea cave or something, they will hop in and out of the nest, and there'll be one really awkward chick at the bottom and one really awkward at the top of the cliff or something. The parents have to feed them, but they're going backwards and forwards, but they're not fully, if they went to try and fly, they could fly, but they wouldn't be very fit. And it's that stage where we're going to be moving them to the aviary so that they do that bouldering phase in the release site, so they can see the environment, they can experience the wonderful Dover weather we've been having, but they can also see, we've got peregrine around, who are the natural predators. The actual just the landscape, they can see sheep around and all sorts. They're learning at that stage, and that's the crucial stage, as you said, and that's what we did in Jersey. We had 2 cohorts where we had hand-reared birds that we released, and it's really fascinating to watch them understand that environment. But they have a lot of there's a lot of innate behavior, but there is that very crucial development stage when they're early on, and I think that's where a lot of projects, this differs from a lot of other reintroduction projects where they tend to wait for the birds to be independent to let them go. These birds are social birds that learn from each other, and they learn from their surroundings, and it's really important we get this right.
Great, thank you.
So we've got another question from Pamela here. If you live among fields but don't own those fields, what can you do?
I was pondering this because I saw it in the chat
Hmm.
whilst you were talking, Liz. It's a tricky one. Jade's nodding. Might hand over to her in a second.
Yeah, I think obviously a very key thing is awareness of what insecticides you're using. The Chough do rely on being able to access soil insects, and there's nothing stopping you from finding out who owns the land, and that's something that we can absolutely support with on Next Door Nature, and learning, and maybe they might need to know sort of how that affects the Chough and how their management styles are affecting the Chough.
Yeah, definitely. Can also get involved in land management-y ways if you have any time you want to give. Oh yeah, but I think chatting to your neighbours is always a really good one.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has any questions, you can sort of, if you're not aware, there's a little chat sort of button at the bottom where you can type up your question if you have one. Fabulous. I think you've answered everything. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
One other thing I just remembered, I forgot to say at the end, if you do suddenly think, oh my gosh, I wish I asked this thing, we have a mailbox, which is chough@wildakent.org.uk, and we have a newsletter, which if you it will ask you when you sign up for the talk, doesn't it, Emma?
Yes, I believe there's a check box there.
If you do want to receive the newsletter and you tick that box, it's coming to you quarterly.
Right, we have actually just got one more last minute question in, if that's okay. So Ralph has asked, what's the likely population level you're aiming for based on the suitable habitat present in the area now? Interesting.
I think that's one of those $64 million questions that we have ourselves. And it's quite an interesting one because I don't think there's a straightforward answer, and that's not just to get out of answering the question. So there's two aspects. What is available now will be different to what could be available if we do continue some more habitat restoration. I think the other interesting thing with the choughs is their nesting behavior. So he mentioned the sea caves and crevices, but what you see in Midland Wales, you see it in Spain. They use farm buildings, and we saw it in Jersey where they started to try and use big horse stables. So we're talking like housing about 4 or 5 different horses and space for your truck and everything else in it, but barns like that and structures like that where they're looking for other nest sites. And so it'd be interesting to see what is available on the coast. Historically, Kent has never, from what we can see, has never had a huge population compared to, as I said, Wales and Cornwall. But we can also, for want of a better word, manipulate it slightly because we can provide nest boxes. They're doing that in the wild in Wales, where they're not too sure why they've been losing birds from the inland sites, but they're also having issues with cliff erosion. So you can add more, you can add a nest box, and that supports a breeding pair. In Jersey, we released 43 captive bred birds over a 5-year period. They started breeding within a sort of a year of being released. And now the population is well over 50% of wild hatched birds. And it's been stable since about 2019, of having about 7 solid breeding pairs. You'll get pairs trying but failing. And I think that is probably going to be similar to the Kent initial project for those first 5 years. That might be the sort of numbers that we're aiming for. We're certainly going to be aiming to release 30 to 50 birds, individuals, expecting to lose some to peregrines or just, not getting it right. But yeah, I think in initial stages, that's what we're looking for. But overall with this project, what's really exciting for us is that we're looking and we're working with other NGOs and people to see how we can connect up the Kent population with an existing Cornish population by doing various reintroductions and habitat management across the south coast and returning that southern population back to England. So sorry, that's a very long-winded way of not answering your question.
Still think it's a fabulous answer, thank you. So we've got another one in from Joanne here. So she's asked, did some troughs stay at Dover Castle for the winter and some others returned to Dover Castle this spring? So
Do you want me to take that one, Liz?
Go on.
Yep. So the short answer is no. We didn't have any birds at Dover Castle, but just to clarify, the birds currently at Dover Castle are in the aviary. And this really, the role of these birds is to kind of remind people what a red-billed chough is and to re-engage the public and just reawaken that cultural connection before we start doing our releases. So there are no birds free flying in Kent at the moment. We're going to do our first releases this summer. Once we have birds free flying, we're going to rethink whether we still have birds in the aviary at Dover Castle. So the ones currently at Dover Castle stay there just for the summer to tell the story, and then over winter, because the castle is closed and there's no staff to look after them, they come back to Wildwood to overwinter. So it's their summer residence, and it's just part of the public engagement part of the project.
brilliant, thank you. Does anybody else want to ask a question? If something does pop to mind, do email us and we can get back to you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. How exciting to see so many different organisations and people working together on such a fabulous project, and can't wait to hear more updates. Looks like it's all going on this summer. Right, we'll call it a wrap then. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Very good.